I was here in DC to testify for the Protecting Roe Women's Health Care Act hearing that was called by Senator Blumenthal. And as people have probably followed this hearing, it's radical. This legislation would not only codify Roe, but it would take it even one step further to make sure that states could never pass any kind of legislation that would, in their words, quote unquote, restrict abortion access. And it is radical. This is not the will of the people. And so Senator Cruz's office had reached out to me about testifying, of course, in opposition of this bill. And that makes sense. As someone who survived a failed abortion, I have a pretty important perspective on this legislation. I did survive an abortion procedure. I aged myself very quickly. I'm 43. And that's important for a historical context. Roe and Doe were passed in 1973. I survived an abortion in 77. So, the Roe versus Wade is effectively my death sentence. I survived a saline infusion abortion. It was the most common abortion procedure back in the 1970s, involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid that surrounded me in the womb. And the intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald me to death. Usually it lasted about 72 hours. The child's life would end, if they were lucky, within the first 24. Then they would induce labor, expelling that deceased child from the womb. In my case, my medical records show that I soaked in that toxic salt solution for actually 5 days. They just kept trying time and time again to induce my birth mother's labor, and they weren't successful until the 5th day. They thought I would be delivered as a successful abortion, but that is the day that I was accidentally born alive. I weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces, which indicated to the medical professionals that my birth mother, Ruth, was much further along than the 18 to 20 weeks that the abortionist had indicated on my medical records. And in fact, we now probably think she was more like 31 weeks. That's what a neonatologist remarked. And that's pretty common. I actually testified to that in the hearing. So many abortion survivors are alive today because the abortionist didn't correctly estimate how far along they were gestationally. And this was not about women's health care. Abortion is not health care. We know that, but that was the thread that continued to come about in yesterday's hearing. Is abortion is health care, women need this, and they made it clear that they had no qualms about the fact that they don't want any restrictions or protections. And this isn't only an issue about protecting unborn children, it's also about protecting women. That bill is dangerous to the health and the well-being of women also. Even if I hadn't survived an abortion, I would be passionate about this because as a woman, I know that abortion is not the solution to any problem that we are facing in our world. There's no other issue where we would say, ending the life of another human being is the solution to this problem. But yet when we use the word abortion, then suddenly it becomes, acceptable and something to be championed and pushed. And, my story is one that is pretty inconvenient for people in that hearing. And Senator Hawley did a great job in this hearing of asking, specifically about born alive legislation, because I do come to DC and testify quite frequently on behalf of my population of survivors. This is the work that God called me to, and I am honored to do the work that I do with survivors at the Abortion Survivors Network and our Education and Policy Center. But we talked yesterday, Senator Hawley said, why is it that people don't support born alive legislation? And he made it very clear, right, who he was talking to in the room. He was talking about the Democrats. Why do you continue to fight this legislation? And he said, Melissa, why is it that they, in your opinion, do they not support this? And, it's very simple. Abortion survivors humanize the unborn. And so we see lawmakers not supporting born alive legislation because if you humanize, if you accept us for who we are and what was done to us, then you have to thereby accept that the unborn are who they are. And then that leads you back to the fact that what we have done as a nation is so wrong.